This is Trekzone's That Time When.
Yes, indeed. Welcome to That Time When. Matt Miller with you in Trekzone's Studio 4. Very excited to have this podcast back. It is the podcast when we take you through the archive here at Trekzone, diving through podcasts that you might have missed, or if you're new to the channel, you haven't caught yet. This one's a good one. When we started branching out from just science fiction, Star Trek and science fiction, started looking at science and space, and it's a technical one, but it's a little bit fascinating. It's something that you might not have considered. Space law. What is it, and what exactly are its implications as we launch into the beyond Earth once more? Artemis, of course, on Launchpad 39B right now, getting ready to go back to the moon. What are the legal implications for human spaceflight once again? Let's find out with this podcast from the Trekzone archive. Well, I'm now joined by Dr. Imogen Saunders, an expert on space law. Imogen, thanks so much for a little bit of your time today.
My pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about space law.
Well,
such a broad-ranging question, but where do we begin?
It absolutely is. Space law is fascinating, especially at the moment, because space is governed by a series of treaties that were created and signed over 50 years ago. And so the world that these treaties were created in, space exploration looked very different than it does today. And so we're now looking at a new dawn of space, a new reality for the use of space, and we have a legal framework which might not be quite equipped to handle it.
It's an interesting dilemma, I guess, because, as you say, when it was developed and space exploration was very much done by the governments, and those governments were the US and Russia. There was no sort of militarization of space or permanent habitation sort of on the horizon, or even private companies sending tourists into space.
Absolutely. So the current regime is really based on the assumption that it will be government agencies that are exploring space. And as we know today, government agencies are certainly still involved in space, but we also have a lot of private actors. And the treaty framework doesn't necessarily deal with that reality.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What are some of the challenges that the treaties could be faced with?
So one of the big things is actually the use of space resources. And space resources, what I'm talking about essentially is asteroid mining. Now, this is something that hasn't occurred on commercial scale yet, but it probably isn't too long until it becomes feasible. And the question is, who owns these resources? Can a private company make private profit from minerals or metals that they get from an asteroid? Or are these resources something that should belong to the whole of humanity? The treaties seem to suggest that space should be treated a bit like areas on Earth that are called the common heritage of mankind. So I'm talking here about the deep seabed, for example. But the treaties are not conclusive on that. And we have at least two countries, the United States and Luxembourg, who have now passed national laws allowing their citizens to make private profits from resources gained in space.
It's very interesting that it's Luxembourg.
Yeah, absolutely. The United States makes a lot of sense. Luxembourg a bit less so. But Luxembourg is really trying to position itself as a centre for space exploration. And as well as passing these laws, it's also entered into agreements with other countries, including Japan and Portugal, and it's currently talking to Russia about a bilateral agreement about space resources.
It's really funny too, because when we sort of talk about mining asteroids and the resources that, I mean, they're so rich in resources, it's almost like a lot of things that are in the headlines of science and space news at the moment. It all was the realm of science fiction, not a couple of decades ago.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this is fantastical, futuristic imaginings in some way, but on the other hand, it's also potentially very, very profitable. And so because of that, you're seeing a lot of money and a lot of research, a lot of resources put into making this reality. Well,
some of the space law that is being tried at the moment, or at least tested at the moment, there's one particular case that Brad and I covered on a recent Talking Science in regards to an astronaut that was allegedly, or has been accused of allegedly using space station computers to access her husband's or her ex-husband's financial records.
This is actually not too much of a hard question for space law, just because of the particular situation on the International Space Station, in that all the countries who have contributed to the International Space Station have signed an agreement that essentially says whatever part that they have contributed is treated as their own territory. So in this case, it was a United States astronaut. She accessed a computer in the United States section of the ISS. And so because of this agreement between the states, it's actually treated no differently than if she'd actually done it on Earth in the United States.
And one analogy that I guess Brad and I were sort of likening to is a little bit like embassies on Earth. So if it's at the US embassy here in Canberra, is that sort of the same sort of jurisdiction? It falls under American purview.
Exactly. But the reason that happens is because the countries involved agreed that it would. So it's very similar to embassies in that embassies exist because the hosting country agrees that the country coming in can essentially treat the embassy ground as their own territory. And the ISS agreement works the same way, that each of the countries that contribute agreed that their part would be their own territory. Where it would get more complicated is if something like this occurred in a situation where perhaps it wasn't a governmental space station, but you had a vessel or some kind of station that had been built by a private company. And so you didn't have an agreement between governments that they would treat that vessel as territory. And then the legal issue as to where this crime actually occurred would become a lot more interesting.